In October 1942, a year that would leave the world in shock, the Wehrmacht's Sixth Army faced encirclement at Stalingrad. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Rommel was in Germany on sick leave. General Stumm was left to defend a crumbling line at El Alamein, lacking fuel, food, and ammunition. Allied forces were tightening their grip through ultra-intelligence, Royal Navy strikes, and relentless bombing campaigns against Axis supply lines. Montgomery was preparing Operation Lightfoot. He planned to send infantry through the mined Devil's Gardens after a heavy bombardment. Deception played a key role, with dummy tanks and fake pipelines used to conceal the real assault in the north. Tragically, Stumm died of a heart attack in the heat of battle. Von Thoma hesitated, and Rommel hurried back to find his armored units immobilized, with no fuel and over half of his tanks destroyed. Operation Supercharge forced a retreat, a move Hitler attempted to counter with orders to hold the line. This transformed a strategic withdrawal into a prolonged flight across Libya. At the same time, the Allies readied and initiated Operation Torch. This venture clashed with Vichy politics involving Darlan and Gouraud and saw chaotic assaults on the ports. This chapter discusses the decision-making process, the harsh realities of the battle, and how Torch and Alamein together broke Axis control in North Africa as the Soviet encirclement in the east closed in. In October of the same year, while Zhukov and Vasilevsky prepared their major encirclement of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, Rommel remained in Germany on sick leave. He had been suffering from stress-related issues, including low blood pressure and digestive problems. His last effort to break through the Eighth Army at the Battle of Alam Halfa had ended in failure. Many of his soldiers were also ill, facing severe shortages of food, fuel, and ammunition. After all his ambitions of conquering Egypt and the Middle East collapsed, Rommel refused to accept blame. He began to believe that General Feldmarschall Kesselring was deliberately withholding supplies from the Panzer Army Africa out of jealousy. The situation for the Panzer Army Africa was dire. The Italians in the rear and the Luftwaffe kept the majority of supplies for their own use. German morale was at a low point. Thanks to ultra-intelligence, Allied submarine operations and bombing raids, even more freighters were sunk in October. Hitler's mistrust of his Anglophile allies led him to believe that German transports were being betrayed to the British by the Italians. The idea that German Enigma codes might have been compromised never crossed his mind. General of the armored troops Georg Stumm, the corps commander who faced a court-martial for losing the plans for Operation Blau, led the army during Rommel's absence. General Lieutenant Wilhelm von Thoma took command of the Afrika Corps. Adolf Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht did not expect the British to launch an attack until the following spring. They believed there was still a chance for the Panzer Army Africa to break through to the Nile Delta. However, Rommel and Stumm had a clearer understanding of the situation. They realized they could do very little against Allied air power and the Royal Navy's assaults on their supply convoys. Rommel grew increasingly frustrated with the complacency he observed in Berlin when he was given the title of Field Marshal. Hermann Göring downplayed the threat from Allied air power, asserting that the Americans could only produce razor blades. Rommel retorted, wishing they had such razor blades. Hitler then promised to send 40 new Tiger tanks along with units of Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, seemingly believing these reinforcements would compensate for their shortages. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht minimized any talks about possible Allied landings in Northwest Africa in the near future. Only the Italians viewed the threat seriously. They created contingency plans to seize French Tunisia, a move that the Germans opposed due to fears of resistance from the Vichy French forces. In reality, the Allies were further along in their planning for Operation Torch than the Italians had anticipated. In early September, tensions eased for Dwight D. Eisenhower as transatlantic disagreements were addressed. There would be simultaneous landings at Casablanca on the Atlantic coast, as well as at Oran and Algiers in the Mediterranean. However, a supply issue arose, stemming from confusion and a shortage of shipping, creating a significant challenge for his Chief of Staff, Major General Walter Bedell Smith. Many troops crossing the Atlantic arrived without weapons or equipment, which delayed their amphibious training. On the diplomatic side, Both the American and British governments reassured Francisco Franco's regime in Spain that they did not intend to infringe on Spanish sovereignty, either in North Africa or on the mainland. This was essential to counter German claims that the Allies aimed to take the Canary Islands. Fortunately, the pragmatic General Conde Francisco de Jordana resumed his position as foreign minister after Franco dismissed his pro-Nazi brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Suñer, for being overly ambitious. The small and elderly Jordana was resolute in keeping Spain neutral during the war. His appointment in September brought relief to the Allies. Stumme, despite having limited information, was convinced that Montgomery was gearing up for a significant offensive. He increased patrol efforts and ramped up the laying of almost 500,000 mines, creating what were dubbed Devil's Gardens in front of the Panzerarmee Afrika's positions. Following Rommel's advice, Stumme bolstered the Italian formations with German units and divided the Afrika Corps. The 15th Panzer Division took position behind the northern front, while the 21st Panzer Division was stationed in the south. General Alexander acted as a protective shield, helping to keep Montgomery safe from Churchill's impatience. Montgomery needed adequate time to train his new forces, particularly Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden's ex-Armored Corps, which he optimistically referred to as his Corps de Chasse. The newly arrived Shermans were being prepared, boosting the 8th Army's strength to over 1,000 tanks. Lumsden, a colorful cavalryman and Grand National winner, was not Montgomery's top choice, but Alexander favored him. Montgomery's plan, Operation Lightfoot, aimed to launch a major attack in the northern sector, which was the most heavily defended. He believed the Germans would not anticipate this move. Lumsden's X-Corps was to take advantage of a breakthrough once XXX Corps crossed the minefield south of the coast road. To facilitate this crucial part of Montgomery's strategy, Major Jasper Maskelyne, a professional illusionist, devised an elaborate deception plan. Maskelyne set up hundreds of dummy vehicles and even constructed a fake water pipeline in the southern sector. They increased radioactivity in the area, broadcasting pre-recorded messages, while vehicles raced around dragging chains behind them to create dust clouds. To bolster this aspect of Montgomery's strategy, Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks' 13th Corps was set to attack, followed by the 7th Armored Division, with a third of his artillery supporting them. On the far left of the Alamein line, Koenig's Free French would launch an assault on the strong Italian position at Karat el Himeimat on the edge of the Katara Depression, though they lacked enough support for such a challenging objective. On October 19th, the Desert Air Force and American forces began a series of bombing and strafing raids on Luftwaffe airfields. 4 days later, at 8:40 p.m. on October 23rd, Montgomery's artillery launched a heavy bombardment on Axis positions. The ground shook from the blasts, and the flashes lit up the night sky, resembling sheet lightning. Allied bombers targeted the reserve positions and rear areas. General Stumme, concerned about depleting his ammunition, instructed his artillery to refrain from firing back. As dusk fell, sappers moved cautiously forward under the rising moon, using bayonets to probe the sand and lifting mines to establish safe corridors marked with white tape and oil lamps. At 10 p.m., XXX Corps moved through those corridors with 4 divisions: the 51st Highland, the 9th Australian, the 1st South African, and the 2nd New Zealand, each supported by at least 1 armored regiment. The freshly arrived Highlanders advanced with pipes playing and bayonets ready, knowing that Italian troops feared cold steel more than nearly anything else. Infantry casualties were relatively low, but Montgomery was frustrated when Lumsden's tanks from X-Corps became tangled in the minefields. This delay resulted in heavy losses once dawn arrived. General Stumme wanted to assess the situation at the front himself, but when his vehicle came under fire, the driver sped off without realizing Stumme had exited. Stumme suffered a heart attack, and his body was not discovered until the next day. When General von Thoma learned of Stumme's death and assumed command, he hesitated to initiate a major counterattack, fearing to waste fuel before his troops could be resupplied. However, on October 25th, both the 15th Panzer Division in the north and the 21st Panzer Division in the south launched successful local counterattacks. Montgomery's overarching plan was faltering. The Germans did not take the bait of his feint, and no forces were redirected to the south to meet the diversionary attack by 13th Corps. Meanwhile, the German minefields and Axis resistance in the north turned out to be much stronger than anticipated. Montgomery unjustly blamed the 10th Armored Division, even accusing it of cowardice when it was actually being misused. His disdain for cavalry tactics hindered his ability to effectively utilize armor. After hearing about the British offensive and Stumm's passing, Rommel ordered a plane to take him to Africa via Rome. He arrived at his headquarters at dusk on October 25th. In Rome, he had heard that the fuel situation had worsened due to the Royal Navy and the Allied Air Forces. The British attack gained momentum when the Australians captured 2 German officers who were carrying detailed maps of their minefields. During the night, the Australians took control of a key hill and managed to hold it against intense counterattacks the following day. With the buildup of XXX Corps and X Corps, the pressure on the Panzerarmee Africa was becoming overwhelming. Rommel then learned that the tanker they had relied on had also been sunk. He warned the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht that with little fuel and a shortage of ammunition, continuing the battle would be difficult. By now it was clear that Montgomery was focusing the majority of his forces in the north, prompting Rommel to move the 21st Panzer Division to assist. Without enough fuel for his tanks to withdraw and launch a mobile fight, he was stuck in a battle of attrition that he could not win. More than half of his tanks had been destroyed, either by the 6-pounder anti-tank guns or through air attacks. The new 40mm gun on the American P-39 Airacobras proved to be a highly effective tank-killing weapon. Faced with such a determined defense, Montgomery needed to adjust his plan. He prepared a new offensive while the Australians endured the ongoing counterattacks. On November 2nd, Operation Supercharge commenced in the early hours with a heavy bombardment followed by air assaults. Montgomery ordered the 9th Armored Brigade to charge against entrenched anti-tank guns. He was cautioned that this might be suicidal, but he insisted it had to be done. The attack turned out to be disastrous, and the brigade was nearly annihilated. Freiberg's New Zealand division advanced well north of Kidney Ridge, but German counterattacks with both panzer divisions halted their progress. Nevertheless, holding the bridgehead represented the Panzer Army's last stand. Montgomery was finally making headway in the battle of attrition. Rommel ordered a withdrawal towards Fuka, knowing that the unmotorized troops, mostly Italian, would be quickly overwhelmed. Many German soldiers seized Italian trucks for themselves at gunpoint, leading to chaotic scenes. That evening, Rommel sent a message to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, explaining the situation and his reasons for retreating. A staff officer's misunderstanding meant that Hitler did not receive the signal until the next morning. Believing there was a conspiracy to prevent him from reversing Rommel's retreat, Hitler became furious. Scenes of hysteria erupted at Führer headquarters. The shock of Rommel's defeat was completely unexpected for Hitler. He had been focused on Stalingrad and the Caucasus. His faith in Rommel as a commander made it unimaginable for him to face such a failure. Shortly after midday on November 3rd, he sent Rommel an order. He stated that in Rommel's current position, there should be no thought of retreat. He urged Rommel to throw every available weapon and soldier into the battle. He promised support from the Luftwaffe and supplies. He concluded by claiming that resolute determination can triumph over stronger enemy forces. He offered his troops only one option: victory or death. Rommel was rattled and confused by this command. However, Hitler's self-deceiving lies, which allowed him to ignore the reality of defeat, would soon be repeated to General Paulus in the area west of Stalingrad. Despite his military instincts, Rommel felt he must comply. He issued orders to halt the withdrawal. Only the Italian divisions in the south were instructed to move northwestward. This decision allowed Horrocks's 13th Corps to advance without opposition on November 4th. Further north, 10th Corps broke through, capturing the Africa Corps headquarters and General von Thoma, who surrendered to the 10th Hussars. Confident of Kesselring's support, Rommel ordered a general retreat. He informed Hitler that it would only go to the Fuka line, but it extended all the way across Libya. The fact that the remnants of the Panzer Army escaped at all was due to Montgomery's slow responses and excessive caution. After achieving his victory, he did not want to risk any setbacks. Some argue that his failure to trap Rommel during his retreat led Hitler to make the disastrous decision to send more troops to North Africa, all of whom were eventually captured. However, this does not reflect well on Montgomery's abilities as a general, as that was never part of any grand strategy. The victory at Alamein was certainly not due to strategic or tactical brilliance. Montgomery's choice to attack the strongest part of the German line was, at best, questionable. His infantry and armored troops fought with great courage, and they benefited from his ability to change the mood of the Eighth Army. However, the battle was mainly won due to the impressive contributions of the Royal Artillery and the Desert Air Force. They relentlessly targeted the Luftwaffe, tanks, and supply lines. The Royal Navy and the Allied Air Forces also played a crucial role in disrupting the Axis supply route in the Mediterranean. On November 7th, while Adolf Hitler was traveling to Munich to deliver a speech to the Nazi Party elite, his special train was stopped in Thuringia. He received a message from the Wilhelmstrasse that warned an Allied landing in North Africa was about to occur. In response, he immediately ordered the defense of Tunisia. Yet, when he learned that the Luftwaffe could do little from such a distance, he became furious with Hermann Göring. The many conflicting rumors about Allied intentions and his fixation on the capture of Stalingrad meant that the German High Command was not prepared for a new front. A major concern was how the Vichy regime would respond to an Allied invasion of its North African territories. Joachim von Ribbentrop joined the train in Bamberg and urged Hitler to reach out to Joseph Stalin through the Soviet ambassador in Stockholm. Hitler outright rejected this suggestion. The idea of negotiating during a moment of weakness was unacceptable to him. He continued to work on a speech that claimed the German capture of Stalingrad was just around the corner and highlighted his determination to fight until a final victory. His pride held him back from considering any alternative. He ignored Rommel's defeat and chose not to mention the Allied landings in North Africa, instead recalling his prediction about the annihilation of the Jews. Even Joseph Goebbels recognized that they were at a turning point in the war. Most Germans, apart from the intensely loyal Nazis, felt victory was further away than ever. Reports on civilian morale from the Sicherheitsdienst made this clear. Few shared Göring's belief that Americans could only produce razor blades. The increasing Allied bombing of their cities showed a growing material advantage. For Dwight Eisenhower and his planners, how Vichy France and Francisco Franco's regime in Spain would react was also a vital concern. Eisenhower soon discovered he had entered a complex maze of French politics. Roosevelt had no interest in dealing with General de Gaulle. He pressured Churchill to keep the Frenchmen in the dark about their plans. Churchill's relationship with de Gaulle was already tense. The French suspected that the British were eyeing Syria and Lebanon. Churchill understood that de Gaulle would be infuriated if he learned he was being kept uninformed. De Gaulle would never agree that the Allies needed to negotiate with the Vichy authorities in North Africa to prevent heavy fighting. However, Churchill had one proposal aimed at appeasing the proud general. The Royal Navy, still mindful of the Japanese aircraft that launched from Vichy airfields in Indochina to sink the Prince of Wales in the Repulse, remained wary of Madagascar. This French colony was situated along their convoy routes off the southeastern coast of Africa. Shortly after the disaster in Malaya, a landing force was assigned to Operation Ironclad, which aimed to capture the main port of Diego Suarez at the northern tip of Madagascar. Initially, both General Brooke in London and Wavell in the Far East opposed the plan due to the many threats they faced. However, in early March 1942, American intelligence intercepted Japanese naval codes. These codes revealed that Berlin was pressuring Tokyo to attack British supply ships in the Western Indian Ocean. On March 12th, the War Cabinet approved Operation Ironclad. In early May, British forces set sail from South Africa and launched a night assault on the port of Diego Suarez, landing Marines in a bold fashion reminiscent of Admiral Lord Nelson. However, the plan halted there, as it was expected that an arrangement would be made with the Vichy authorities in the capital of Tananarive. Then, on May 30th, a Japanese midget submarine torpedoed the battleship HMS Ramillies in Diego Suarez Harbor. This submarine flotilla went on to sink 23 ships carrying supplies for the Eighth Army. This marked the sole direct support the Japanese provided to their German allies during the war. Churchill, initially hesitant but persuaded by Field Marshal Smuts, agreed to the full conquest of Madagascar. He believed this could pacify de Gaulle, who had aimed to capture the island with Free French forces, but was furious to learn of the British plans to engage the Vichy authorities there. Once the entire island was secured, it could be handed over to Charles de Gaulle. This was finally accomplished on November 5th, following an ineffective guerrilla campaign led by the Vichy governor, Armand Annette. A week before Annette surrendered, Winston Churchill graciously asked General de Gaulle who he preferred for the role of governor of Madagascar. De Gaulle suspected the Allies were planning an invasion in North Africa. However, had he known about the American negotiations with Vichy generals in preparation for Operation Torch, he likely would have left the room in anger. Robert Murphy, the American chargé d'affaires in Vichy, who was now President Franklin Roosevelt's representative in French North Africa, believed that de Gaulle should be entirely excluded from the plans. For many officers within the French colonial army, de Gaulle was still regarded as little more than a traitor collaborating with the British. They needed a leader they could trust. General Henri Giraud was a tall and courageous officer known for his impressive moustache, but not for his intellect. De Gaulle referred to him as the Tin Soldier. Giraud had been captured while leading the French 7th Army in 1940 and had escaped from Königstein, a fortress prison in Saxony. He made his way to Vichy, where Pierre Laval, the prime minister under Philippe Pétain, sought to hand him back to the Germans, but the Maréchal would not allow it. Murphy believed Giraud would serve the Allied interests best, but Giraud had other ambitions. He insisted on being the commander-in-chief of Operation Torch and demanded that the Allies land in France in addition to North Africa. He also preferred that the British stay out of it, as the Royal Navy's attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kébir was still a painful memory. Giraud was also a close ally of General Charles Mast, a key commander of French forces in North Africa. Murphy, who had built a network among senior officers and officials, facilitated a secret meeting between General Mast and his fellow conspirators with Lieutenant General Mark Clark, who was Eisenhower's deputy. On the night of October 21st, Clark arrived near Algiers from the British submarine HMS Seraph, accompanied by commando bodyguards. His main mission was to persuade Mast that American forces would be so overwhelmingly powerful that the French should not try to resist them. Clark asserted that 500,000 troops would be landed, yet the actual forces numbered just 112,000. Mast cautioned him that while the Army and Air Force might be convinced, the French Navy would resist fiercely. Other French officers supplied Clark with crucial information regarding troop placements and defenses. Concerned about being discovered by local authorities, who had been alerted to smugglers in the area, Clark returned to the submarine that night without his trousers. Despite this slight embarrassment, his perilous mission was largely successful. The submarine HMS Seraph, camouflaged as an American vessel, was dispatched to pick up Giraud from the Côte d'Azur and transport him to Gibraltar to meet with Eisenhower. Axis agents and aerial reconnaissance observed the increasing shipping presence at Gibraltar. Fortunately for the Allies, German intelligence mistakenly believed the ships were meant to reinforce Malta or to land troops in Libya to obstruct Rommel's escape. Consequently, German U-boats in the Mediterranean were diverted to the Libyan coast, far from where the invasion forces would land. Another theory circulating among the Axis was that the Allies aimed to capture Dakar on the West African coast for use as a naval base, aiding their efforts in the Battle of the Atlantic. Through Murphy, the Americans had received signals from Admiral Darlan. Admiral William D. Leahy, who had previously served as Roosevelt's ambassador to Vichy, viewed Darlan as a significant opportunist. Darlan's disdain for Laval, who had succeeded him as Pétain's deputy, did not inspire trust. Nevertheless, even Churchill was willing to negotiate with this staunch Anglophobe if it might bring the French fleet at Toulon to the Allied cause. Eisenhower preferred to follow Giraud, but upon arriving in Gibraltar, Giraud expected to be appointed as the Allied commander-in-chief. Rarely had military operations been so intertwined with political intrigue and personal rivalries. On November 4th, just 4 days before the landings, Darlan, who had been touring French colonies in Africa, flew to Algiers. He had just learned that his son, a naval lieutenant suffering from polio, had taken a turn for the worse. Darlan was unaware that Allied fleets were at sea, and when his son's condition improved, he intended to return to Vichy. The Western Task Force, consisting of 35,000 troops under the command of Major General George S. Patton, had already departed from Hampton Roads, on his way to Casablanca. The other 2 task forces that had sailed from England were making their way into the Mediterranean, heading for Oran and Algiers. In total, the troop ships were accompanied by 300 warships, all under the command of Admiral Cunningham, who was pleased to be back in the Mediterranean. On the evening of November 7th, Darlan was dining at the Villa des Oliviers, the residence of General Alphonse Juin, the commander-in-chief in Algiers. Juin had taken over from Weygand, who was now in prison at Königstein due to Hitler's concerns that he might ally with the Allies. Towards the end of dinner, the chief naval officer in Algiers burst in with news that the Allied ships were possibly not heading to Malta as expected. They might actually land troops at Algiers and Oran. Darlan dismissed these worries and went to bed, planning to fly out early the next morning. At midnight, Murphy heard the code word on the French service of the BBC confirming the landings were set to proceed. He dispatched the French irregulars he and General Mast had gathered to secure key locations and headquarters. In the early hours of November 8th, Murphy visited the Villa Olivier and woke Juin to inform him about the landings. Juin was initially stunned. He stated that he needed to speak with his senior officer, Admiral Darlan, who was in Algiers. Murphy felt it was necessary to speak with Darlan, so a Buick was sent to bring him. Darlan arrived in a rage. The short, bald, barrel-chested admiral, who always smoked a pipe, earned the nickname Popeye from the Americans, who were amused by his elevated shoes. Darlan's animosity toward the English had deep roots, as his great-grandfather had been killed at the Battle of Trafalgar. However, he was also known for switching sides. Following the 1940 armistice, the experienced French politician Édouard Herriot remarked about Darlan, "This admiral knows how to swim," referring to his secret alliance with the capitulators after initially promising the British full resistance. While Murphy tried to calm Darlan and persuade him that opposing the landings would be pointless, a group of Mast's irregulars arrived and took Darlan and Juin prisoner. Shortly after, a squad of gendarmerie came to free them and apprehend the insurgents and Murphy. Murphy had anticipated the arrival of American troops by this time, but they had mistakenly landed further down the coast. A much larger disaster was occurring simultaneously. The British plan to seize the ports of Algiers and Oran quickly turned into a complete failure, resulting in heavy casualties. In Oran, for example, 189 men died, and 157 were wounded from a force of 393. The Royal Navy also suffered, with 113 dead and 86 wounded. This understandably incited a considerable amount of anger among the Americans. In the harbor, French shore batteries and naval vessels targeted 2 Royal Navy destroyers flying the American flag as they tried to bring in American landing parties, reminiscent of the incident at Diego Suarez. An airborne operation involving a single American parachute battalion aimed at capturing Oran's airfields also ended in disaster. Operation Torch seemed to be disintegrating into a grotesque farce. Despite President Roosevelt's request to keep the Free French uninformed, Winston Churchill had asked General Ismay to notify General Pierre Biot, Chief of Staff to Charles de Gaulle, just before the landing began. However, Biot chose not to disturb de Gaulle, who had gone to bed early. When de Gaulle learned the news the next morning, he was furious. He exclaimed, "I hope the Vichy people will throw them into the sea. You don't get France by burglary." Yet, after having lunch with a calming Churchill, de Gaulle managed to compose himself. That evening, he delivered a broadcast expressing full support for the Allied operation. It wasn't until American troops finally arrived in substantial numbers, many hours late due to the chaotic landings, that Admiral John Darlan's attitude shifted. He requested a meeting with the commander of the 34th Infantry Division to discuss a ceasefire which was established for Algiers. French troops would return to their barracks without surrendering their arms. Adolf Hitler's doubts about the Vichy regime's reliability as an ally heightened. Breaking diplomatic ties with the United States was inadequate, as was Pierre Laval's consent for Axis aircraft to utilize French airfields in Tunisia. On November 9th, Laval was called to Munich and challenged to demonstrate his loyalty to Germany by declaring war on the Allies. This request proved too much for Laval and the rest of the Vichy administration. Meanwhile, Darlan declined to extend the ceasefire to Casablanca and Oran, where fighting continued. He needed to understand the developments in Munich and in France. Confusion increased when General Giraud arrived in Algiers, followed by General Marc Clark. Clark suggested they focus on Giraud's situation and shift attention away from Darlan. Giraud wisely accepted that Darlan outranked him and avoided causing issues. Meanwhile, back in the humid tunnels of the Rock of Gibraltar, Eisenhower had received only a few unclear reports to evaluate the situation. There had been no updates from General Patton regarding the Casablanca landings. Eisenhower, feeling the pressure, chain-smoked his Camel cigarettes and hoped for the best. In Munich, Adolf Hitler met with Count Ciano, Mussolini's foreign minister. They received Pierre Laval and demanded that French troops secure ports and airfields in Tunisia for the landing of Axis forces. French anger towards Italy, due to Mussolini's betrayal in June 1940, was so strong that Laval hesitated to allow Italian troops onto French soil. However, he indicated he would comply with a German ultimatum as long as Marshal Philippe Pétain could formally protest. The following morning, on November 10th, Darlan arrived at the Hotel St. George in Algiers, which Clark had made his headquarters. Clark's blunt approach did not sit well with Darlan, who pointed out his higher rank. In fact, Clark even threatened to impose Allied military government over all of French North Africa. Despite the tension, Darlan kept his composure, knowing he needed to buy time. He could not order the ceasefire Clark desperately wanted until Hitler sent troops into the demilitarized zone in France, which would violate the 1940 armistice. Upon hearing from Clark that the negotiations had stalled, Eisenhower reacted angrily, exclaiming that what he needed was a skilled assassin. At least on that day, the United States 1st Infantry Division secured Oran, suffering 300 casualties. However, French forces continued to resist Patton's troops in Morocco, even after most of their warships were sunk during a fierce battle off Casablanca. Early the next day, Hitler declared that German troops would occupy southern and southeastern France as part of Operation Anton. He would still acknowledge Pétain's government, but the marshal's reputation was now severely damaged. Many of his supporters believed he should have fled to North Africa to join the Allies. Hitler also ordered the occupation of the Pyrenees by German troops. Franco's government was anxious that Hitler might insist on moving troops through Spain to launch an attack on Gibraltar. On November 13th, a council of ministers in Madrid ordered a partial mobilization. With Germany's advance into the unoccupied zone of France, Darlan could now argue that Pétain was effectively a captive. He instructed that the ceasefire should apply throughout French North Africa. However, Darlan failed to deliver the French fleet in Toulon, contrary to Churchill's expectations. The commander at Toulon, Contre-Amiral Jean de Laborde, held a grudge against Darlan. He feared that his sailors and officers might want to ally with the disliked Anglo-Saxons, so he remained loyal to Vichy in splendid isolation. With assurances from officers of the Kriegsmarine that German forces would not attempt to seize his ships or the port, Laborde decided to stay. Yet, as SS panzer troops arrived and dissent grew among his crews, he had to make a decision. When German forces entered the port, he ordered the fleet to be scuttled. Almost 100 warships were either sunk or blown up. Operation Torch resulted in 2,225 casualties for the Allies, with about half of them killed, while the French suffered around 3,000 losses. Both Patton and Clark acknowledged the landing's chaotic nature. They recognized that if they had faced the German army rather than poorly armed French colonial troops, they would have faced disaster. British officers made condescending jokes about how green is our ally, but the disarray and poor logistics were painful to read in the reports afterward. This situation highlighted that General Marshall's wish for an early invasion of France would have ended in failure. Regardless of Churchill and General Brooks' reasons for pushing the Americans to invade North Africa, the outcome was undeniably the right one. The United States Army had much to learn before it could confront the Wehrmacht in Northern Europe or Tunisia. Troop morale is often unstable, swinging between despair and elation. The swift victories in Morocco and Algeria fueled an unrealistic optimism. American soldiers, buoyed by cheap local wine, thought they were seasoned and nearly battle-hardened. Those who witnessed the outdated French Renault tanks falling to their new bazookas shouted, "Bring on the Panzers!" Even Eisenhower told Roosevelt he expected to capture Tripoli by late January. Out on the frozen Don steppe, news of the Soviet encirclement spread quickly among the Sixth Army. On November 21, 1942, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and his chief of staff took the last two Fieseler Storch light aircraft from their headquarters at Golubinsky to Nizhny-Cherskaya, just outside the Kessel. The next day, they held a conference with General Hoth of the 4th Panzer Army to review the situation and communicate with Army Group B through a secure line. However, upon learning of Paulus's location, Adolf Hitler accused him of abandoning his men. He ordered Paulus to return to his staff at Gumrak, located 15 kilometers west of Stalingrad. Paulus felt deeply insulted by this accusation, which prompted Hoth to reassure him. They discussed Hitler's command for the Sixth Army to hold its ground despite the imminent threat of encirclement. Believing that Hitler would soon change his mind, they agreed that urgent air resupply of fuel and ammunition was critical for a breakout. Yet the commander of the 8th Flieger Corps warned them that the Luftwaffe did not possess enough transport aircraft to supply an entire army. With the panzer units running low on fuel and the infantry divisions lacking horses, Paulus realized that the Sixth Army would have to abandon all its artillery, and importantly, its wounded, if it wanted to escape. His chief of staff, General Lieutenant Arthur Schmidt, a stocky man with small eyes and thin lips, remarked that this scenario would resemble a Napoleonic disaster. Paulus, familiar with the campaign of 1812, found this possibility haunting. General Major Wolfgang Pickert, commander of the Luftwaffe's 9th Flak Division, arrived during the discussion and announced that he would withdraw his division immediately. He understood that the Luftwaffe could not sustain the Sixth Army through air supply. Hitler had no intention of letting his forces retreat from Stalingrad. He had invested too much credibility in capturing the city, especially after his bold claims during a speech in Munich just 2 weeks earlier. He instructed General Feldmarschall Erich von Manstein to leave the Northern Front and establish a new Army Group Don to break through and aid the Sixth Army. Upon hearing Hitler's directive, Hermann Göring gathered his top transport officers. Although the Sixth Army required 700 tons of supplies each day, Göring asked his officers if they could manage 500 tons. They stated that 350 tons would be the absolute maximum, and only for a brief period. Hermann Göring, eager to gain favor with Adolf Hitler, assured the Führer headquarters that the Luftwaffe could resupply the Sixth Army. This misleading promise sealed the fate of General Friedrich Paulus and his forces. On November 24th, Hitler commanded Fortress Stalingrad on the Volga to hold out under any circumstances. The Red Army encircled around 290,000 men in the Stalingrad Kessel, which included over 10,000 Romanians and more than 30,000 Russian Hiwi auxiliaries. Hitler forbade the release of this information in Germany. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht reports intentionally distorted the actual situation, but rumors began to circulate at home. Hitler aimed to shift the blame for the Soviet victory onto anyone but himself. A heated argument arose with Marshal Ion Antonescu at the Wolfschanze in East Prussia, as Hitler attempted to place the blame for the disaster on the Romanian armies on the flanks. Antonescu angrily pointed out that the Germans had refused to supply his troops with sufficient anti-tank guns, and that their warnings of an impending attack had been ignored. He was unaware that the Sixth Army was now withholding rations from his soldiers. German officers remarked, "It's pointless to feed Romanians because they surrender regardless." Sixth Army troops cut off west of the Don had succeeded in falling back just in time to rejoin the main force. The Stalingrad Kessel took on the appearance of a crushed skull, with the forehead in the city and the rest of the perimeter defending out in the Don steppe, measuring 60 kilometers by 40. German soldiers cynically referred to it as the fortress without a roof. Rations, which had already been inadequate before the encirclement, were further reduced. Soldiers grew weary from digging trenches in the frozen ground. In the barren steppe, there was little wood available to cover the earth bunkers. Officers tried to boost the soldiers' morale by saying, "Even death is better than a Russian prison, and we must hold out until the end. The fatherland cannot possibly forget us." The Soviet encirclement reclaimed large portions of captured territory. When Red Army troops arrived, they were met with tears of joy from the plundered and starving civilians. However, the NKVD followed closely behind to arrest anyone suspected of collaboration. The headquarters of the Don Front initiated a series of attacks in the early days of December. Their aim was to divide the Kessel. However, their intelligence team significantly miscalculated the number of troops they had encircled. General Rokossovsky's chief of intelligence believed they had trapped 86,000 soldiers, but the true figure was 290,000. Soviet officers also underestimated the Germans' determination to hold on. The promises made by the Führer about relief were seen as absolute truth, especially by younger soldiers raised under National Socialism. One soldier from the 376th Division wrote home with hopeful naivety, saying, "The worst is past." He expressed hope that they would escape the Kessel before Christmas. He believed that once this encirclement battle was over, the war in Russia would come to an end. Supply officers had a more realistic outlook. They had reduced rations to between 1/3 and 1/2 of the usual amount. The scarcity of fodder meant that the few remaining horses would have to be killed. According to the chief quartermaster of the Sixth Army, at least 300 flights per day were required to sustain them. However, during the first week of the airlift, there were fewer than 30 flights on average each day. Additionally, a significant portion of the supplies brought in was aircraft fuel for the return flights. Hermann Göring had not accounted for the fact that the airfields within the Kessel were within range of Soviet heavy artillery. Enemy fighter planes and anti-aircraft batteries posed a constant threat. On one day alone, 22 transport planes were lost due to enemy fire and crashes. On some days, the weather was so poor that very few aircraft could get through. Richthofen repeatedly contacted General Oberst Hans Jaschonek, the chief of staff of the Luftwaffe, to warn him that the air resupply plan was doomed. Göring could not be reached as he had sequestered himself in the Ritz Hotel in Paris. Meanwhile, during this time, Joseph Stalin had the Stavka working on more ambitious strategies. Building on the success of Operation Uranus, he aimed to encircle the rest of Army Group Don and trap the 1st Panzer and 17th Armies in the Caucasus. Operation Saturn involved a major offensive from the southwest and Voronezh fronts, advancing through the 8th Italian Army toward the lower Don, where it meets the Sea of Azov. Zhukov and Vasilevsky agreed that Manstein would likely attempt to relieve the Sixth Army by launching an attack from Kotelnikovo to the northeast. Therefore, they decided to limit their strategy to an assault on the left rear flank of Army Group Don. This operation was renamed Little Saturn. Manstein was indeed planning as they suspected. An advance from Kotelnikovo was nearly his only option. He codenamed his offensive Operation Winter Storm. Adolf Hitler aimed to reinforce the Sixth Army so it could sustain its position on the Volga for future operations in 1943. However, Manstein was secretly working on a second operation called Thunderclap to rescue the Sixth Army, hoping that Hitler would reconsider his orders. On December 12th, General Hoth's 4th Panzer began their northward attack. He had received reinforcements from the 6th Panzer Division based in France and a battalion of new Tiger tanks. Soldiers from the 6th Army on the southern edge of the Kessel heard the artillery fire 100 kilometers away. They spread the word, Der Manstein kommt. They believed that Hitler's promise was about to come true. Unbeknownst to them, Hitler had no plans to allow a retreat. Hoth's attack surprised Soviet commanders. Vasilevsky worried about the 57th Army in the way, but Rokossovsky and Stalin chose not to change their plans. Eventually, Stalin consented and ordered General Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army to redirect its focus. The delay was not as detrimental as it could have been, as a sudden thaw with heavy rainfall hindered Hoth's tanks during a fierce battle on the Mishkova River, which was less than 60 kilometers from the edge of the Kessel. Manstein hoped Paulus would take initiative and break out to the south, disregarding Hitler's commands. However, Paulus was too loyal to the command structure and would not move without a direct order from Manstein himself. Additionally, his troops were too starved to march far, and his panzers lacked sufficient fuel. Stalin approved the adjusted Little Saturn and ordered it to commence in 3 days. On December 16th, the 1st and 3rd Guards Armies and the 6th Army launched an assault on the lightly defended Italian front. The Italians held a different perspective on the war against the Soviet Union compared to the Germans. Italian officers were taken aback by the Germans' discriminatory views towards the Slavs. When they replaced Wehrmacht units, they worked much harder to provide food for the Russian prisoners engaged in heavy labor. They also formed friendships with local villagers who had been robbed of their clothing and food by the Germans. The strongest Italian units were 4 from the Alpine Corps, the Tridentina, the Giulia, the Cunines, and the Vicenza divisions. Unlike regular Italian infantry, the Alpini were accustomed to harsh winter conditions. However, their equipment was lacking. They improvised new footwear from tires of destroyed Soviet vehicles. They had no anti-tank weapons, their rifles dated back to 1891, and their machine guns often froze in the Arctic weather. Their vehicles, still camouflaged for desert warfare, did not function in intense cold, which sometimes dipped below -30 degrees Celsius. Their mules struggled in deep snow, succumbing to exhaustion, lack of food, and freezing temperatures. Many soldiers suffered from frostbite. Like the Germans, they scavenged for supplies, taking padded jackets and felt boots from fallen Red Army soldiers. Rations of minestrone and bread arrived frozen solid. Even the wine was ice. Italian soldiers and officers resented the fascist regime that had ill-equipped them for this war. As Red Army divisions charged forward with their battle cry of "Urrah! Urrah!" many Italian 8th Army units showed more resolve than anticipated. Yet, poorly armed and lacking reserves, their defense soon fell apart in chaos. Exhausted and weakened by dysentery, Italian troops retreated through the snow in long lines like refugees, wrapped in blankets. The Alpini Corps held their ground, strengthening the left flank of the Hungarian 2nd Army. Soviet tank brigades advanced behind them, with the wide-tracked T-34s moving quickly across the newly fallen snow. A sudden drop in temperature made the ground hard again. Supply dumps and railway junctions with cargo trains were captured without resistance. The transfer of the 17th Panzer Division to support Hoth's attack left Army Group Don without reserves in the rear areas. The greatest threat to the 6th Army emerged when the 24th Tank Corps took control of the airfield near Tatsinskaya. This airfield served as the primary air transport base for supplying the Kessel. General der Flieger Martin Fiebig ordered his crews of Junkers 52 to take off for Novocherkassk as the tanks approached the airfield. They began to take off in swift succession while the tanks fired at them. Some aircraft erupted into fireballs. One tank even collided with a plane as it was taxiing for takeoff. In total, 108 Junkers 52s managed to escape, but the Luftwaffe lost 72 aircraft, which was almost 10% of its entire transport fleet. The only other airfields that could supply Stalingrad were located much farther away. Little Saturn forced Manstein to completely reconsider his strategy. The relief of the 6th Army was no longer feasible, and soon he would have to withdraw from the Caucasus. Manstein either lacked the heart or the courage to inform Paulus about the dire situation facing his army. Some officers understood their grim fate. The divisional chaplain of the 305th Infantry Division wrote, "We will never see our homes again. We will never get out of this mess." In contrast, Soviet intelligence officers discovered that German prisoners remained in denial and clung to confused reasoning about the possibility of defeat. A Luftwaffe navigator, whose Junkers 52 was shot down on the Stalingrad run, stated, "We must believe that Germany will win the war, or what is the point of continuing?" A soldier shared this stubbornness, saying, "If we lose the war, we have nothing to hope for." In Stalingrad, they were unaware that Germany's North African front was being pressured from both sides. The main objective of Operation Torch was to occupy French Tunisia before Axis forces could send troops there. However, the Germans responded with remarkable speed. On the morning of November 9th, before Algiers and Oran were secured, the first German fighter planes landed. Infantry and paratrooper advance units followed in transport planes the next day. The local French commander, still acting under orders from Vichy, chose not to protest this violation of the 1940 armistice terms. Hitler had no intention of giving the Allies a base for launching an invasion of southern Europe, an offensive he knew would eliminate Italy from the war. He planned to significantly reinforce North Africa, even in this critical moment on the Eastern Front. Despite Stalin's doubts and the large protests in London calling for a second front now, the North African campaign was proving to be more effective than the failed plan to invade France in 1942. The airlift over the Mediterranean occupied a fleet of Junkers 52 transport planes, which could have been better used to support the Sixth Army. The Allied push east toward Tunis was disorganized and lacked a solid plan. The thin British First Army, led by the pessimistic Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, was reinforced by several American armored units and some French infantry battalions. Even with the limited size of his forces, which numbered less than a corps, Anderson mistakenly divided them into 4 lines of attack. He was unaware that the Axis had already positioned 25,000 men by November 25th. The First Army achieved its only significant success that day when Blade Force, consisting of the 1st Battalion of the United States 1st Armored Regiment and the 17th 21st Lancers, moved toward Tunis from the west. The American Stuart tanks encountered a Luftwaffe airfield near Jeddah. In a bold attack resembling an SAS raid, their crews charged across the runway, shooting at stationary Junkers 52s, Messerschmitts, and Stukas. They destroyed over 20 aircraft. This surprise attack caused chaos and led General-Lieutenant Walther Nering, who commanded the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel, to tighten his defensive perimeter. However, the strike on the airfield did little to diminish German air superiority. Meanwhile, German paratroopers and other forces ambushed the predominantly British columns, resulting in heavy losses. The 2nd Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers suffered 144 casualties in a single assault on Medjez against a paratroop battalion supported by 88mm guns and several tanks. To make things worse, American aircraft mistakenly strafed their own ground forces, leading them to fire back at any airplane in sight, adopting the motto, "If it flies, it dies." The arrival of the 10th Panzer Division and some new Tiger tanks inflicted serious punishment on Anderson's troops on December 3rd, forcing them to retreat with significant losses. It was an unfair battle against a more skilled and better equipped enemy. Eisenhower felt relieved upon reaching Algiers after weeks spent in the damp tunnels of the Rock of Gibraltar. However, instead of focusing on the struggling campaign in Tunisia, he soon found himself caught up in supply issues and the complexities of French politics. Eisenhower was extremely frustrated with the French officers and their excessive sense of honor. He had hoped that the Allies had reached a practical agreement. Darlan had been appointed as the High Commissioner for North Africa, and Giraud was set to be the Commander-in-Chief of the French forces. However, Eisenhower still wanted to maintain supreme command over all Allied troops. Meanwhile, Churchill supported Darlan only to secure the French fleet in Toulon, but that aim vanished along with the scuttled ships. Eisenhower soon faced a shocking revelation. Once details of the Darlan deal became public in the United States and Britain, people were outraged. The media and public sentiment strongly condemned the idea that the Allied Supreme Commander had placed a Vichy collaborator at the helm in North Africa. This was especially disturbing given that anti-Semitic laws were still enforced and political prisoners remained incarcerated. The Gaullists were experiencing particularly harsh treatment. Despite this, Darlan did not seem very pleased with his new role. He knew that the Americans might soon abandon him, as if he were of no further use. De Gaulle wisely chose to remain silent in public, recognizing that the Americans had created this predicament. It is possible he understood that Vichy officers detested him almost as much as they disliked the British. Although he never admitted it, the American strategy of engaging with Darlan and Giraud before him would eventually be advantageous for him. These two figures helped prevent a civil war from breaking out in North Africa. The Special Operations Executive was concerned about the growing skepticism the Darlan deal was generating, not only among the Gaullists in London, but also in terms of Allied relations with the French resistance in the interior and even in other nations. Together with the American Office of Strategic Services, the Special Operations Executive quickly established bases in Algiers to train many young French volunteers for operations in Tunisia. One of their recruits was named Fernand Bonnier. He began mingling in monarchist circles and added de la Chapelle to his name as a grand gesture. Those who envisioned a restoration, with the Comte de Paris becoming King of France, saw de Gaulle as a potential regent ready to facilitate this change, due in part to the general's family's known monarchist ties. In this complicated web of intrigue, a plan to assassinate Darlan began to emerge. It involved Gaullists who sent $2,000 from London through General François d'Astier de la Vigerie to fund the operation. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Dodds Parker of the Grenadier Guards, the senior officer of the Special Operations Executive in Algiers, was also involved, along with Fernand Bonnier, who executed the plan. Dodds Parker had helped the French resistance leader Jean Moulin board his aircraft for his final journey to France. He trained Bonnier in shooting and later claimed, though inaccurately, that his own gun was used in the assassination. The plan called for Bonnier to escape Algiers on the Mutin, a boat led by Jerry Holdsworth from the Special Operations Executive's secret flotilla, which infiltrated agents into the Mediterranean. However, after ambushing and shooting Darlan in the stomach on December 24th, Bonnier was captured, court-martialed, and executed quickly to avoid a trial that could reveal many embarrassing details. Eisenhower, disturbed by the incident, even though he had previously sought a damned good assassin, called Dodds Parker to Allied Force headquarters and demanded a clear assurance that the Special Operations Executive was not involved. Dodds Parker assured him that it was not. It is difficult to know how much awareness of the plot existed beforehand. The Office of Strategic Services in London was certainly informed and gave approval. However, it appears that neither Winston Churchill nor Sir Charles Hambro, the head of the Special Operations Executive, authorized it. The dispatch of the squeezed lemon sparked little sorrow, even among the Allies who had supported him. Franklin D. Roosevelt callously remarked to a White House guest on New Year's Eve that Darlan was simply a son of a bitch. Meanwhile, in the Stalingrad pocket, the encircled Sixth Army tried to maintain their spirits as Christmas approached. Despite suffering from lice, cold, and hunger, they found some escape in thinking about the holiday. They knew that Manstein's Operation Winter Storm to save them had failed, yet many soldiers still suffered from Kessel fever, believing they could hear the artillery of the SS Panzer Army, which Hitler promised would come to their rescue. They could not accept that their Führer would abandon the Sixth Army. However, both the High Command and Manstein recognized that it would need to be sacrificed to keep the Soviet armies surrounding it engaged while the German forces in the Caucasus were evacuated. Soldiers of the Sixth Army dreamed of celebrating Christmas in the German way. They exchanged small gifts with one another, often tiny carvings or rationed food that they could hardly spare. In their snow-covered bunkers, a remarkable spirit of camaraderie blossomed in the face of hardship. On Christmas Eve, they sang Silent Night, Holy Night, and many were moved to tears at the thought of their families back in Germany. However, this Christian compassion did not extend to the Soviet prisoners in the two camps nearby. Starved of food to save on German rations, The few remaining survivors were forced to consume the bodies of their fallen comrades. Reality could not be ignored for much longer. No supply flights had come for 2 days due to the Soviet tank assault on Tatsinskaya airfield. The Sixth Army was gradually succumbing to starvation, surviving on wassertsuppe, which was just bits of horse meat boiled in melted snow. The Army's pathologist, Dr. Hans Gergensson, who had been flown into the encirclement in mid-December, made a shocking discovery after performing 50 autopsies. Soldiers were perishing from hunger far more quickly than they would have under normal conditions. He determined that this was due to the combined effects of stress, prolonged malnutrition, lack of sleep, and extreme cold. These factors disrupted the body's metabolism. Even if a soldier consumed a few hundred calories of food, only a small portion was actually absorbed. This weakness diminished his ability to fend off illness. Those who were not sick were far too frail to attempt an escape through the deep snow. Moreover, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus did not have the strength to contradict Hitler's orders. Conditions in the field hospitals were unimaginable. Blood from open wounds froze within the tents. Limbs affected by frostbite were amputated. Pliers were used on fingers. There was no anesthesia left, and those suffering from severe stomach or head injuries were left to die. The already overwhelmed surgeons had to make ruthless decisions on who to treat. "The German soldier suffers and dies with uncomplaining bravery," wrote the chaplain of the 305th Infantry Division. Even the amputees remained composed. Now, only the walking wounded were evacuated by air, as stretchers took up too much space. Armed military police tried to control the throngs of injured soldiers and malingerers who rushed toward each plane on the icy runways at Gumrak and Potomnik airfields. Even having a spot secured on a plane did not guarantee survival. The crowded Junkers 52s and large Focke-Wulf Condors struggled to climb before reaching the perimeter, where Soviet anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Soldiers watched several planes crash in fiery explosions, aware they were filled with wounded comrades. The arrival of 1943 brought an irrational wave of hope when Hitler promised in his message that he and the entire German army would do everything possible to relieve the defenders of Stalingrad. He claimed that with the soldiers' steadfastness, they would achieve the most glorious feat in the history of German military accomplishments. Out of respect for the suffering of the Sixth Army, Hitler prohibited the consumption of brandy and champagne at his headquarters. The German public was still unaware that the Sixth Army had been encircled. Soldiers who wrote home faced harsh penalties if they revealed this truth. One soldier sent a New Year's drawing and wrote in tiny letters in the corner in French, "It's been 20 days since we were surrounded. It's terrible to be trapped here. Yet they tell us to hold on, hold on. We only get 200 grams of bread each day and some horse-meat soup. We have almost no salt. Lice are torturous, and it is impossible to get rid of them. It is dark in the bunkers, and outside it's 20 or 30 degrees below zero." However, his letter never reached home, as it was in a postal sack on one of the transport planes that got shot down. The intelligence department on the Don front used German communists and deserters to sort through intercepted mail. Another soldier wrote sarcastically, "On the first holiday, we had goose with rice for dinner. On the second day, it was goose with peas. We have been eating goose for a long time. Only our geese have 4 legs and horseshoes." Stalin was impatient with every delay in launching Operation Ring, the final blow for the Sixth Army. Rokossovsky commanded 47 divisions supported by 300 aircraft. On January 8th, Don Front headquarters sent 2 emissaries under a white flag to offer surrender terms to General Paulus. But likely on the orders of his Chief of Staff, General Lieutenant Schmidt, they returned with the document they had brought. 2 days later at dawn, Operation Ring commenced with heavy artillery bombardments and the sounds of Katyusha rocket batteries. Red Army officers now proudly referred to their massed guns as the God of War. The primary attack targeted a bulge known as the Marinovka Nose, located in the southwest of the Kessel. German soldiers, bundled up like scarecrows, struggled to grip their weapons with their swollen, frost-bitten fingers. The white landscape was dotted with snow piles that marked unburied bodies. Black shell holes marred the ground, their edges stained yellow from cordite. In the southern sector, a Romanian division fell apart, leaving a 1-kilometer gap in the defense. The 64th Army swiftly deployed a brigade of T-34 tanks, their tracks churning through the frozen snow. German divisions in the southwest, forced to retreat, found it impossible to dig new trenches due to the hard ground. They had so little ammunition that they waited until the Soviet attackers were nearly at point-blank range. A chaplain from the 305th Division noted the brutal Soviet onslaught, reporting how tanks crushed the wounded, and there was merciless shooting of both the injured and prisoners. The Potomnik airfield was a scene of chaos, filled with charred aircraft and piles of frozen corpses outside the hospital tents. There was barely enough fuel left to evacuate the remaining wounded to field hospitals. Some were pulled on sledges until their comrades could go no further, completely exhausted. The misery was almost unimaginable. Dispirited soldiers, shell-shocked and desperate, attempted to flee back toward the ruined city in such numbers that the Feldgendarmerie struggled to maintain order. Yet many men continued to fight, often alongside Russian highways, who understood the dire consequences that awaited them when the battle ended. On January 16th, Potomnik was abandoned, and the last Messerschmitt stationed there took off on orders from Richthofen. The smaller airfield at Gumrak was also unable to accommodate transport aircraft and was now under direct artillery fire. The Luftwaffe started parachuting supplies in, but most landed behind Soviet lines. That day, an entire battalion from the 295th Infantry Division surrendered. Some battalion commanders could no longer bear to witness their men suffer. They moved on frost-bitten feet, their cracked lips and bearded faces reflecting the pallor of impending death. Crows circled overhead, landing to peck at the eyes of the dead and dying. The Red Army showed no mercy, especially after making grim discoveries. When liberating the village of Novomaximovsky, the Don Front NKVD reported that soldiers discovered 76 Soviet prisoners in 2 buildings with bricked-up windows and doors. 60 of them had died from starvation, and some bodies were decomposed. The remaining prisoners were barely alive. Many could not stand due to severe malnutrition. It was revealed that these individuals had endured about 2 months without food. The German forces were allowing them to starve to death. Occasionally, they would toss them pieces of rotten horse meat and provide salted water to drink. The officer responsible for Gulag 205 stated in a Smersh interrogation that, beginning in December 1942, the command of the 6th German Army, led by Lieutenant General Schmidt, completely halted food supplies to the camp. This led to mass deaths from starvation. Soviet soldiers showed no mercy to the German wounded, especially after encountering the last surviving Russian prisoners who had been starved in another camp in Gumrak. Tragically, the rescuers unintentionally killed them by giving them too much food. On January 22nd, the headquarters of the 6th Army received a message from Adolf Hitler. The message stated that surrender was out of the question. Troops were ordered to fight until the end. If possible, they were to hold the diminished fortress with the soldiers that were still able to fight. The bravery and tenacity of the fortress had supposedly created an opportunity to establish a new front and launch counterattacks. The 6th Army had thus fulfilled a significant role in what was described as the greatest moment in German history. In Stalingrad, where men crawled on all fours like wild animals, the conditions in cellars were even worse. As many as 40,000 wounded and ill soldiers remained alive in the 6th Army. On badly frostbitten hands and feet, toes and fingers would often come away with bandages as they were removed. No one had the strength to carry away the bodies of those who had died. Gray lice could be seen crawling from the bodies in search of living flesh. On January 26th, the remnants of the 6th Army were divided in 2 when the 21st Army reached the lines of Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Division, north of the Mamayev-Kurgan. Paulus, suffering from dysentery, fell into a state of nervous collapse in the cellars of the Univermag department store in Red Square. Schmidt then took command. Several of his generals and senior officers chose to end their lives rather than face the disgrace of surrender. Some men opted for a soldier's suicide, standing in a trench, waiting to be shot. Hitler announced the promotion of Paulus to General Feldmarschall. Paulus recognized this as a disguised order to take his own life. However, with all his admiration for Hitler gone, he had no plans to give the Führer that satisfaction. On 31st January, Red Army soldiers entered the Univermag building. The Soviet interpreter, a Jewish lieutenant named Zachary Reisman, noted that Paulus was completely unnerved. His lips were quivering. He expressed to General Schmidt that there was too much noise and too many people in the room. Reisman escorted 151 German officers and soldiers back to their divisional headquarters, intervening to protect them from Red Army soldiers who aimed to humiliate them along the way. A German colonel declared, intending to be overheard, "Such is the irony of fate. A Jew is ensuring that we are not harmed." Paulus and Schmidt were taken to the 64th Army headquarters of General Shumilov, where their surrender was recorded on film. Paulus's nervous tic was clearly noticeable. Hitler received the news of the surrender in silence, staring into his vegetable soup. The next day, his anger erupted against Paulus for not taking his own life. On 2nd February, General Strecker, who led the few remaining troops of Sef's corps in the ruins of northern Stalingrad, also surrendered. The Red Army discovered they had 91,000 prisoners, far more than anticipated. Due to their lack of preparation, these prisoners received no food or medical care for a time. By spring, nearly half had died. Soviet casualties from the entire Stalingrad campaign reached 1.1 million, with nearly 500,000 deaths. The German army and its allies also suffered, losing over 500,000 men, either killed or captured. In Moscow, the bells of the Kremlin rang in celebration of victory. Stalin was depicted as the chief architect of this historic success. The reputation of the Soviet Union rose globally, attracting many recruits to communist-led resistance movements. In Germany, radio stations had orders to play somber music. Having stubbornly denied that the Sixth Army had been encircled since November, Goebbels now attempted to claim that the entire Sixth Army had died heroically in a final stand. They died so that Germany might live. However, his effort to create a heroic narrative quickly backfired. Word traveled quickly in Germany, especially among those secretly tuning into the British Broadcasting Corporation, that Moscow had announced the capture of 91,000 soldiers. The shock of this defeat hit Germany hard. Only the most devoted supporters of the Nazi regime still believed victory was possible. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht was troubled by the significant unrest among the German public following the surrender of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. They issued a stern warning to officers to avoid worsening the situation by criticizing the military or political leadership with what they called so-called factual accounts of the battles. Despite efforts to instill a National Socialist vision within the armed forces, reports indicated that older officers from the Reichswehr, who were accustomed to a more neutral military approach, showed little interest in indoctrinating their troops. Enthusiastic officers and members of the Schutzstaffel expressed frustration that the Red Army was far more effective in its ideological training. On February 18th, Joseph Goebbels introduced the slogan, "Total War, Short War," at a mass gathering in the Berlin Sportpalast. The energy in the room was palpable. From the stage, he shouted, "Do you want total war?" The audience sprang to their feet, shouting their agreement. An anti-Nazi journalist present even admitted later that he had joined in, barely stopping himself from shouting "yes" along with the crowd. He later told friends that if Goebbels had asked if they wanted to march to their deaths, the audience would have cheered in acceptance. The Nazi regime had ensnared the entire population, regardless of their willingness, as accomplices in its own crimes and madness. In December 1942, while Anderson's First Army faced challenges in the rain-soaked hills of Tunisia, Montgomery's Eighth Army failed to aggressively pursue the retreating German Panzer Army. Montgomery, concerned about maintaining his reputation as a harbinger of victory, was wary of suffering casualties from a counterattack, a tactic at which the German army excelled. Many regiments were also satisfied to let others do the chasing, as the commanding officer of the Sherwood Rangers put it. They believed they had done enough and chose to focus on spoils, such as Luger pistols, alcohol, cigars, and chocolate taken from abandoned German vehicles. Montgomery rightly noted that the British Army was not yet ready to compete with the Germans in a fast-paced war. However, his biases against cavalry led to overly cautious operations. Only the armored car regiments, including the 11th Hussars and the Royal Dragoons, were positioned close enough to consistently bother the retreating Germans. Despite Rommel's forces being reduced to around 50,000 men and having less than a battalion of tanks, Montgomery hesitated to take risks. At one point, he considered leaving both Tripoli and Tunis to Anderson's First Army. This sense of complacency was evident among the ranks. Lieutenant Keith Douglas, who served with the Sherwood Rangers, remarked that they had seen the enemy so disorganized that it seemed impossible for them to regroup effectively. When we heard about the North African landings, very few expected more than a couple of weeks of mopping up before the campaign's end, he wrote. The Desert Air Force in Egypt faced criticism for failing to damage Rommel's armored vehicles as they retreated over the Halfaya Pass back into Libya. Their efforts were hindered by delays in bringing fuel and supplies to their forward airfields. Air Vice Marshal Coningham sought assistance from the Americans, leading to Brereton's command, now known as the 9th Air Force, beginning an airlift of fuel to the front lines. Rommel, convinced that the war in North Africa was lost, set up a defense line at Mersa El Brega, just east of El Agheila on the Gulf of Sirte, where he had initiated his desert campaign in February 1942. On January 14, 1943, President Roosevelt arrived in Casablanca, weary from his 5-day journey from the United States. He met with Prime Minister Churchill that evening at Anfa. The following day, the combined chiefs of staff gathered to listen to Eisenhower's update on the North African campaign. The commander of Allied forces was noticeably anxious. He had been ill with influenza, exacerbated by his heavy smoking of Camel cigarettes, and suffered from very high blood pressure. The hastily organized attack on Tunis had not succeeded. Eisenhower attributed the failure to rain and mud, as well as the challenges of collaborating with the French, rather than Anderson's reluctance to consolidate his already weak forces. He also recognized the disarray of the supply system, which his Chief of Staff, Bedell Smith, was attempting to address. Eisenhower presented his plan for an advance towards Sfax by using a division from Major General Lloyd Fredendall's Second Corps. However, General Brooke quickly rejected this idea. He argued that the attacking force would be trapped between the retreating forces of Rommel and General Oberst Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army in Tunis. With his hooded eyelids and sharp features, Brooke resembled a blend of a bird of prey and a reptile, particularly when he licked his lips. Eisenhower, visibly unsettled, agreed to reconsider the plan and left the room. The Casablanca conference was a challenging moment for Eisenhower. He confided to Patton that he feared he might be dismissed. General Marshall also reprimanded him for the poor discipline among American troops and the disarray at the rear. In contrast, Patton's well-organized corps made a strong impression at Casablanca, just as he intended. The primary goal of the conference was to set a clear strategy. Admiral King firmly believed that all Allied resources should focus on Japan in the Pacific. He strongly opposed the idea of maintaining a presence in the Far East. The Americans showed more interest than the British in backing Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. Nonetheless, General Brooke aimed to achieve consensus on finishing the war in North Africa before moving on to Sicily. He was frustrated with Marshall's lack of strategic insight. Marshall still believed in a cross-channel invasion in 1943. Despite the clear reality that the American forces were unprepared to confront the 44 German divisions in France and lacked sufficient shipping and landing craft. Eventually, Marshall had to relent. The British had well-prepared statistics at hand, while the Americans did not. Brooke regarded Marshall as an exceptional organizer of American military strength, but felt he lacked direction on how to utilize it effectively. After convincing the Americans not to invade France, and while they were uncertain about the next steps, Brooke managed to wear them down. He also needed to overcome resistance from the British planning team, who preferred to invade Sardinia over Sicily. On January 18th, Brooke, with the help of Field Marshal Dill, the British military representative in Washington, and Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, the Chief of the Air Staff, convinced the Americans to support their Mediterranean strategy, which included Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Brigadier General Albert C. Wedemeyer, a planner in the War Department who did not trust the British, later admitted, "We came, we listened, and we were conquered." The Casablanca Conference marked the peak of British influence. During the ANFA Conference, British and American leaders got to know each other better, though not always favorably. General George Patton, with his typical bravado, viewed General Alan Brooke as nothing but a clerk. Brooke's assessment of Patton was more accurate. He described Patton as a dashing, courageous, wild, and unbalanced leader, good for operations requiring thrust and push, but at a loss in any operation requiring skill and judgment. The one consensus among the British and Americans was that General Mark Clark was primarily interested in himself. Eisenhower maintained a good relationship with Admiral Cunningham and Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, who would later become his deputy. However, many Americans believed that Eisenhower compromised too much to accommodate British influence in the theater. General Alexander was appointed under Eisenhower to oversee all ground forces. While Patton initially held some respect for Alexander, he soon became frustrated, perceiving a diminishment of the United States Army. It wasn't long before he recorded in his diary, "Eisenhower is more British than the British and is putty in their hands." Eisenhower also disliked the idea of working with a British political counselor like Harold Macmillan. Macmillan was committed to supporting Charles de Gaulle, and after the assassination of Darlan, there was little Eisenhower or President Franklin Delano Roosevelt could do to exclude him. Eisenhower worried about interference in the military chain of command due to Macmillan's close ties to Winston Churchill and his position as a minister. However, Macmillan had no intention of asserting superiority. He understood that the Americans would soon hold almost complete power within the alliance, so he opted for a more discreet strategy. Drawing on his classical education, he compared the Americans to the Romans. He believed that dealing with Britain's stronger ally meant taking on the role of the Greek slaves who ran the operations of Emperor Claudius. Eisenhower felt overwhelmed by the backlash from the American and British press regarding the Darlan Agreement. He expressed to a friend that he saw himself as a mix of a former soldier, a fake statesman, an awkward politician, and a deceitful diplomat. Immersed in details across various areas, he handed political matters over to Bedell Smith, along with many other challenges, which did not ease the troubles that plagued Bedell Smith. Despite his well-known sharpness with American officers, Bedell Smith maintained good relations with both the British and the French. One significant issue in North Africa, which Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt sought to address at Casablanca, was the role of General Charles de Gaulle. Roosevelt remained skeptical of de Gaulle. However, at Churchill's insistence, both Henri Giraud and de Gaulle were compelled to shake hands for the cameras. Roosevelt had carelessly promised Giraud the arms and supplies for 11 French divisions without confirming if that plan was feasible. Initially reluctant to attend Casablanca, de Gaulle was willing to let Giraud remain as commander-in-chief of French forces in North Africa, as long as he could secure political leadership. De Gaulle believed this shift in power would not be too challenging. The brave but less politically savvy Giraud was no match for an established political general like de Gaulle. Once the awkward charade of the two French generals shaking hands was staged for the photographers, President Roosevelt declared that the Allies aimed for the unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan. Churchill agreed with this goal, but was surprised Roosevelt chose to make it public. He felt the ramifications had not been fully considered, despite having secured the War Cabinet's approval beforehand. This announcement, which would somewhat reassure the cautious Joseph Stalin, likely did not significantly alter the war's trajectory. Both the Nazi and Japanese leaderships were committed to fighting until the end. Another crucial decision taken to expedite victory was to intensify the strategic bombing campaign against Germany by utilizing both Bomber Command and the United States 8th Air Force. Stalin, as Churchill had anticipated, was not impressed when he received a joint message from Franklin Roosevelt and the Prime Minister. It was sent from Marrakesh and reported on the decisions made at Casablanca. However, the torch landings had prompted Adolf Hitler to reinforce his troops in Tunisia and occupy southern France. This shift diverted German forces more effectively than a failed operation to cross the English Channel. It also required the Luftwaffe to relocate 400 aircraft from the Eastern Front, which had disastrous consequences. By late spring of 1943, Hermann Göring's units had lost 40% of their total strength in the Mediterranean. Yet, such details did not calm Stalin. He was angered by the Anglo-American decision to postpone confronting the Germans in France through a battle of attrition. The Red Army was still facing, and would continue to face, the majority of the German army. Just a few days before the Casablanca Conference commenced, on January 12th, the Red Army initiated Operation Spark to break the German encirclement of Leningrad south of Lake Ladoga. Georgy Zhukov was sent back by Stalin to lead the offensive. He coordinated the Second Shock Army attacking from the mainland and the 67th Army from the Leningrad side, along with 3 brigades of ski troops crossing the frozen lake. The 67th Army needed to cross the Niva River, causing a delay until the ice was thick enough to support the lighter tanks. The operation started with a heavy bombardment, culminating in a barrage of Katyusha rockets. In temperatures of -25 degrees Celsius, Soviet soldiers dressed in white camouflage surged across the ice. At the southern tip of Lake Ladoga, the Tsarist fortress of Schlisselburg was surrounded. During 2 days of intense fighting in the forests and frozen marshes, the vanguards of both attacking armies came within 10 kilometers of each other. Soviet forces even managed to recover an intact Tiger tank, a significant prize for their engineers to examine. On January 15th, Irina Dunevskaya, a young interpreter, trekked across the frozen Neva to the battlefield. She observed dead men under a transparent crust of ice, as if in a glass sarcophagus. Inside a captured German headquarters, she discovered Red Army soldiers rolling cigarettes using paper from lists recommending medal awards. Based on their nicknames, she speculated that they were former criminals released from the Gulag. Outside, there were treetops snapped off, branches scattered on the ground, uprooted trees, and snow blackened with soot. The bodies of soldiers lay everywhere, some alone and others in piles, mostly enemies but also some of our own. There were corpses of horses, scattered ammunition, and broken weapons, too overwhelming for a woman to witness. A very young blonde German soldier lay on the road in a natural position, as if he were still alive. 3 charred bodies of German soldiers remained in the front seat of their massive vehicle. Once again, there were the bodies of our soldiers frozen under the ice on the highway, squished down by the heavy vehicles that had driven over them. In the distance, the landscape appeared in shades of whitish gray, with the pine trunks showing a grayish-brown hue. The colors conveyed a sense of sternness, coldness, and solitude. A tank driver wrote home to his mother, stating that her prayers must be protecting him. He had gone through a minefield unharmed several times, despite many tanks being destroyed. A shell had exploded in his tank, killing the commander and the gunner, yet he had escaped injury. In this place, one becomes a fatalist and incredibly superstitious. He admitted to feeling a bloodthirsty delight with each enemy soldier he killed. On January 18th, the 2 Soviet armies came together, costing 34,000 lives. They broke the encirclement of Leningrad, though the land bridge to the city was only a dozen kilometers wide. On that same day, Joseph Stalin promoted Georgy Zhukov to Marshal of the Soviet Union. With a new railway built across the captured land south of Lake Ladoga, supplies to Leningrad significantly increased. However, this line remained vulnerable to German artillery. Therefore, the Soviet command initiated another offensive, Operation Polar Star, led by Marshal Timoshenko. Timoshenko ordered that the town of Sinyavino must be taken by Red Army Day on February 23rd. This effort to expand the bridgehead started with a heavy artillery bombardment. The ground was so muddy that the exploding shells barely caused damage, often only sending up geysers of mud. Many shells failed to explode at all. The Red Army troops managed to breach the German lines and advance through the fir and birch forest. Vasily Churkin noted their passing by a field brothel, a 2-story barrack built by the Germans from rough boards. It was said that 75 Russian girls from nearby villages were held there against their will. The German 26th Army Corps skillfully timed its counterattack. Churkin noted that they saw several Tiger tanks moving towards them, firing as they advanced. Following the tanks was German infantry. As the tanks neared, their soldiers began to abandon the trenches and retreat. Platoon commanders shouted at them, urging them to return to their positions, but panic spread quickly. One of the Wehrmacht units that faced heavy losses in Operation Polar Star was the Spanish División Azul, made up mainly of Falangist volunteers. This formation was decided upon in Madrid just 5 days after Operation Barbarossa started. The Spanish right still blamed the Soviet Union as the main instigator of their civil war. Almost 20% of the early volunteers were students, making the Blue Division arguably one of the most intellectually qualified military formations to ever face war. Led by General Agustín Muñoz Grandes, a regular army officer turned Falangist, it was designated as the 250th Infantry Division and sent to the Novgorod front after training in Bavaria. In that area of forests and marshland, the men suffered greatly from illness and frostbite. However, Hitler was impressed by their resilience during attacks and their role in the destruction of General Vlasov's Second Shock Army in the spring of 1942. The Blue Division, defending a sector along the Azora River, endured despite suffering 2,525 casualties in just 24 hours of combat. Although one of its regiments faltered, they re-established their line with German reinforcements. This was the division's largest and most costly battle of the entire war, contributing significantly to the failure of the Soviet offensive. Meanwhile, in southern Russia, Operation Little Saturn forced Manstein to pull back the 1st Panzer and 17th Armies to the Kuban bridgehead in the northwestern corner of the Caucasus, south of Rostov. Rokossovsky expressed his frustration about the downgrade in the offensive and the missed chance to advance to Rostov to completely cut off the enemy. Yet Stalin again fell victim to a surge of optimism, much like the previous year. Ignoring how swiftly the German army could rebound from setbacks, he aimed to liberate eastern Ukraine in the Donbass and Kharkov operations, using armies now available due to the surrender of the 6th Army. On February 6th, Manstein met with Hitler. Initially, Hitler accepted blame for the defeat at Stalingrad, but soon shifted responsibility to Göring and others. He expressed frustration over Paulus's decision not to take his own life. Meanwhile, the Japanese reacted strongly to the news. In Tokyo, Shigemitsu Mamoru, the new foreign minister, along with about 150 Japanese generals and senior officials, watched a film of Stalingrad made by Russian cameramen. The footage showing Paulus and the captured generals deeply disturbed them. They questioned, "Is this true? If it is, why didn't Paulus act like a real soldier and commit suicide?" The Japanese leadership came to the shocking realization that the seemingly invincible Hitler might actually lose the war. With this context, Manstein found himself in a stronger position to request more flexible strategies. Hitler insisted on a stubborn defense of the occupied territories, but the looming threat of collapse in southern Russia offered Manstein a chance to launch one of the war's most surprising counterattacks. The Red Army, having defeated the Hungarian Second Army and encircled part of the German Second Army with the Voronezh front on Manstein's left side, advanced westward toward what would become the Kursk salient. A soldier wrote to his wife on February 10th, sharing, "For the past week and a half, we've been marching through lands just liberated from the fascists. Yesterday, our armored vehicles rolled into Belgorod. We have seized a lot of booty and taken many prisoners. During our march, we keep encountering large groups of captured Hungarians, Romanians, Italians, and Germans. If only you could see, Shirachka, how pitiful this so-called famous gang of Hitlers has become. They wear army boots, some have straw galoshes, others are in summer uniforms, and only a few wear greatcoats. They are clothed in overgarments they've stolen, whether from men or women. They wear caps on their heads, and women's shawls are wrapped around them. Many suffer from frostbite. They are dirty and infested with lice. It's revolting to think that this riffraff managed to get so far into our country. We have already marched 270 kilometers through the provinces of Voronezh and Kursk. So many villages, towns, factories, and bridges lay in ruin. Civilians are returning home as the Red Army arrives. They are so happy. Another section of the Voronezh front advanced toward Kharkov. On February 13th, Hitler demanded that Gruppenführer Paul Hauser's 2nd SS Panzer Corps, along with the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the Das Reich divisions, hold the city. However, Hauser decided on his own to disobey orders and withdraw. Simultaneously, Manstein pulled back the 1st Panzer Army to the River Meuse. The Soviet Southwestern Front, comprising 4 armies, advanced westward. It was led by 4 tank corps under Lieutenant General M. Popov. The Stavka believed they were on the verge of a significant victory, aiming to exploit a gap in the German front south of Kharkov. However, their own supply lines were severely overextended. On February 17th, furious at the disregard for his orders, Hitler flew to Zaporozhye to confront Manstein. Yet, Manstein had the situation under control. He repositioned 4th Panzer Army headquarters to oversee the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which was now bolstered by the Totenkopf Division. He readied the 1st Panzer Army to attack the Soviet forces from below. Hitler felt he had no choice but to support Manstein's strategy. Manstein's double counterattacks decimated Popov's armored force and nearly surrounded the 1st Guards and the 6th Army. The soldiers of the 25th Tank Corps, out of fuel, had to leave all their vehicles behind and trek back to Soviet lines on foot. In the first week of March, 4th Panzer Army advanced back toward Kharkov. Hauser eventually recaptured the city on March 14th after a battle that was needlessly costly. Heavy spring rains soon halted further operations. Soviet prisoners of war were forced to dig graves for the dead. Many were so starving that they rummaged through pockets for scraps of food, which was seen as looting the dead. Typically, they were shot for this, but some sadists went further. One tied 3 Soviet prisoners accused of theft to a gate. After securing them, a soldier wrote that the guards stuffed a grenade into one prisoner's coat pocket, pulled the pin, and ran for safety. The 3 Russians screamed for mercy until the end. Hitler was focused on the vast Kursk salient for a summer offensive to restore German dominance on the Eastern Front. However, the German army in the Soviet Union had been severely weakened. The loss of the 6th Army and its allies was significant. There were also heavy casualties during the withdrawal from the Caucasus. The fighting around Leningrad and the Red Army's Rzhev offensive against the 9th Army took a toll. Many vehicles were left behind during the retreat when they ran out of fuel and were destroyed with grenades. Panzers often had to tow multiple trucks filled with the wounded. The Wehrmacht's strength on the Eastern Front diminished due to troop transfers to Tunisia and to France for a potential Allied invasion. Operations in the Mediterranean caused heavy losses for the Luftwaffe. The strategic bombing campaign against German cities and aircraft factories compounded these losses. The need to protect the Reich led to the withdrawal of fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft batteries, giving air superiority to the Soviets for the first time. By spring 1943, German strength was just over 2,700,000 men, while the Red Army had just under 5,800,000. The Red Army also had 4.5 times as many tanks and 3 times as many guns and heavy mortars. Their greater mobility was thanks to the supply of jeeps and trucks provided by American Lend-Lease. A portion of the increase in the Red Army's strength came from recruiting young women, reaching a maximum of 800,000. While many women had served early in the war, more than 20,000 participated in the Battle of Stalingrad alone. The largest recruitment began in 1943, expanding their roles beyond those of doctor, medic, nurse, telephone operator, signaler, pilot, air observer, and anti-aircraft gun crew. The bravery and competence of women during the Battle of Stalingrad prompted Soviet authorities to recruit more. There were more women in the Red Army than in any other regular army during the war. Although some women snipers gained fame for their skills, the significant increase came with the establishment of a women's sniper school in 1943. Women were believed to resist cold better than men and to have steadier hands. These courageous young women also had to navigate the attentions of male comrades and especially superiors. Ilya Ehrenberg wrote, These girls evoked memories of school-leaving dances, of first love. Most of those he met at the front had just come straight from school. They often flinched nervously. There were too many men nearby with eager eyes. Some women found themselves forced to become a senior officer's campaign wife. This was known as a PPZH, which was a nickname derived from the Red Army's standard submachine gun. The coercion was often blunt. One soldier shared how an officer ordered a young woman in their signals platoon to join a fighting patrol simply because she had refused to sleep with him. Many women were sent back to the rear due to pregnancy. Most soldiers did not judge them harshly. This was just how life was. Each day they faced death at the front line, so people craved some pleasures. However, very few men accepted any responsibility. They used every means to avoid their distraught victims before leaving. Ehrenberg's friend, Vasily Grossman, was outraged by the blatant abuse of rank for sexual favors. He labeled the campaign wife as the Red Army's great sin. Yet he noted, thousands of girls in military uniform were working hard and maintaining their dignity. In the rugged hills west of Tunis, Anderson's First Army struggled to maintain its position. It suffered from a fragmented command structure and a failure to unite its poorly coordinated forces. Tensions grew among British, French, and American officers. Allied troops found themselves outmatched by the highly trained German counterattacks, which combined Stuka dive bombers, artillery, and tanks. Both sides complained vehemently about the relentless rain and the mud. One Gefreiter wrote home about the unbearable conditions, seemingly oblivious to how much worse things were on the Eastern Front. General von Arnim arrived to take command of the forces in Tunisia, now called the 5th Panzer Army. He prepared defenses for the anticipated Allied attacks, while Tunisian Jews were gathered for forced labor. The Jewish community also faced ruthless theft of their gold and money. Rommel's withdrawal from the Mersa El Brega line in December 1942, along with the lack of Allied success in Tunisia, urged Montgomery to advance. However, he missed crucial chances to encircle the remnants of the Panzer Armee, especially when it paused at the Burat line. On January 23, 1943, the 8th Army entered Tripoli, led by the 11th Hussars. Rommel had already retreated to start strengthening the Mareth line at the base of the Bay of Gabes. His goal was to connect with Arnim's 5th Panzer Army. Acknowledging the loss of the war in North Africa, Rommel pushed for a Dunkirk-style evacuation for his troops. His forces lacked adequate fuel and weapons, and he was frustrated trying to make Hitler understand the situation. During a heated discussion at the Wolfschanze in late November, Hitler denied Rommel permission to pull back from the Mersa El Brega line. He even accused Rommel's troops of abandoning their weapons while retreating from Alamein. What was often overlooked was that Rommel's withdrawal, successfully avoiding the 8th Army, was the most skillful part of his entire campaign in the desert. Meanwhile, Mussolini's efforts to convince Hitler to end the war in the Soviet Union were met with resistance. The surrender at Stalingrad and the loss of Libya dealt a serious blow to Mussolini's morale. In response, he removed his son-in-law, Count Sciano, from his position as foreign minister and fell into a depression, choosing to retreat to bed to escape reality. General von Arnim worried that the American Second Corps, under General Lloyd Fredenhall in the south, might break through from the mountains along the route from Kasserine down to the sea at Sfax. This would isolate his 5th Panzer Army from Rommel's forces. Arnim explained the situation to Rommel and requested his 21st Panzer Division to dislodge the poorly equipped French detachment in the Faid Pass. The 21st Panzer launched its attack on January 30th. In response, General Fredenhall's Second Corps reacted slowly to the French calls for help. The next day, a combat command from the United States 1st Armored Division finally counterattacked at the Rocky Pass. The Germans were prepared for them. The line of Sherman tanks faced assaults from Messerschmitt fighters and well-hidden anti-tank guns. More than half of the force was destroyed, and those who survived retreated around burning vehicles. An additional American attempt to advance a few hours later also failed, resulting in heavy losses. Fredenhall, a poorly performing commander, further divided his forces despite Eisenhower's orders to avoid this. He sent another combat command on a fruitless mission with conflicting instructions, Their infantry support, composed entirely of inexperienced troops, was bombed in their trucks by Stuka aircraft. The inexperienced soldiers from the 34th Infantry Division faced increasing difficulties over the next few days, as Fredenhall, who rarely departed his headquarters far behind the lines, ordered more attacks. Rommel aimed to eliminate the American threat with a three-pronged offensive. On February 14th, the 10th Panzer Division advanced westward from the Faid Pass. Simultaneously, the 21st Panzer Division moved up from the south to form a pincer. In the initial day's combat around Sidi Bouzid, 70 American tanks were destroyed. One tank fell victim to a Tiger's 88mm gun from a distance of 2,700 meters. The shell from a Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger, even at close range. On February 16th, a Panzer crewman wrote home, awkwardly apologizing for not writing sooner, citing intense fighting against the Americans. He noted that a Wehrmacht announcement had reported over 90 tanks destroyed. The next day, a detachment from the Afrika Korps moved toward Gafsa, prompting a panic-driven retreat. Near Sidi Bouzid, a battalion of Shermans from the 1st Armored faced an ambush and was eliminated in a desperate but valiant counterattack. The landscape was strewn with burning American tanks, while Tunisian farmers continued to work their fields. American tank crews returned with soot-covered faces, resembling dismounted soldiers after a charge. Neither Fredenhall nor Anderson understood what was happening on the front lines. Rommel traveled to Gafsa on February 16th, where he was greeted by the surviving townspeople. The retreating Americans had significantly damaged the town while destroying their ammunition dump. Rommel intended for his Afrika Korps troops to catch up with the Americans, who were retreating toward Tebessa, where he aimed to seize their primary supply depot. However, Arnhem deemed this plan too dangerous, leading to a contentious discussion with Kesselring. That night, the Panzer divisions advanced toward Spatla. On February 17th, while some American units retreated in fear, others fought valiantly, as acknowledged by the 21st Panzer Division. Fredenhall dispatched any available troops to the Kasserine Pass, but on February 20th, the collapse began. Major General E.N. Harmon witnessed the chaos. It was the first and only time he saw an American army in full retreat. Jeeps, trucks, and all kinds of wheeled vehicles filled the road, often crowded 2 or 3 wide. It was clear what the frightened drivers were thinking. They wanted to escape from the front line and find safety away from the shooting. Fortunately for the Allies, Rommel and Arnhem were in serious disagreement. In trying to do too many things, they split their forces. Some aimed to take Tebessa in the west, while others pushed north to Thala and along a parallel road to Spiba. With a mix of British and American forces blocking the routes to Thala and Spiba, the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions were eventually halted with last-minute support from American artillery. The Afrika Korps unit attempting to reach Tebessa was also stopped by American anti-tank guns and artillery. Rommel recognized how effective the American gunnery was. As the skies cleared, Allied aircraft began targeting his retreating tanks. He returned to the Mareth line on February 23rd, believing he had dealt a significant blow to the Allies that would discourage further advances. The Allied troops, unable to believe the Germans had pulled back, were slow to advance to the Kasserine Pass. The area was strewn with burned-out tanks, crashed aircraft, and bodies in every direction. When American soldiers saw Tunisians looting the dead, they opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, either to kill or just to chase them away. Fredenhall's 2nd Corps had suffered over 6,000 casualties, lost 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, more than 200 field guns, and around 500 transport vehicles. It was a brutal introduction to combat, made worse by confused orders from higher command. Troops fired at their own aircraft, resulting in the destruction or damage of 39 planes, while Allied squadrons mistakenly attacked the wrong targets. On February 22nd, some B-17 flying fortresses bombed a British airfield rather than the Kasserine Pass. Even though Rommel was promoted to command Army Group Africa over General von Arnim, he learned too late about Kesselring's plan for another offensive farther north called Operation Oxhead. This operation did not commence until February 26th, a week later than it should have been coordinated with the attacks around Kasserine. German losses were much heavier than those of the British, and they lost most of their tanks. The Commando Supremo, which Hitler had allowed to regain control for the sake of Axis unity, denied Rommel permission to withdraw from the Mareth line. Knowing that Montgomery was set to launch an offensive, Rommel decided to carry out a spoiling attack. However, ultra intercepts provided the British with all the warnings they needed. Montgomery quickly brought in artillery, anti-tank guns, and tanks to the area under threat, concealing them effectively. On March 6th, the Germans moved into a killing zone that was targeted by all the artillery in the corps. Rommel lost 52 tanks and 630 men during this encounter. Kesselring and Rommel unjustly suspected the Italians of betraying their plans. Rommel, suffering from jaundice and completely exhausted, felt it was time to return to Germany for treatment and some rest. On March 9th, he left North Africa for the last time. The next evening, he met with Hitler at the Werewolf headquarters. Hitler did not listen to Rommel's arguments about withdrawing Army Group Africa across the Mediterranean to defend Italy. He also dismissed any proposals to shorten the front line in Tunisia. Rommel, whom Hitler now viewed as a defeatist, was ordered to take a rest cure. Frustrated by the lack of action in Morocco and how the British seemed to control the war in North Africa, Patton had recently expressed a desire to get into combat. Finally, his wishes were approved. In the second week of March, Eisenhower assigned him, along with Major General Omar N. Bradley, to take over from Friedenthal. Eisenhower also dismissed several other officers, while Alexander wanted to replace Anderson. However, Montgomery refused to let go of the one person Alexander wanted as the new commander of the First Army. Patton wasted no time in asserting his authority over Tough Corps, starting with proper saluting and uniform standards. The Corps was frightened of its new commander, and the military police gained the nickname Patton's Gestapo. Patton was shocked by the number of soldiers evacuated due to combat fatigue. He was also frustrated to learn that he was not to advance rapidly to the sea to cut off Rommel's Panzer Army, now called the 1st Italian Army, from General von Arnim in the north. Instead, his mission was to simply threaten its flank in support of Montgomery. Patton suspected that Montgomery wanted all the accolades. Yet, Alexander, having been alarmed by the chaos at Kasserine, was not ready to trust American troops. Patton took some comfort in his promotion to lieutenant general with 3 stars. Interpreting his orders differently, he advanced his divisions, reclaiming Gafsa and moving toward the eastern Dorsal Massif, which loomed over the plain leading to the sea. When the 10th Panzer Division attempted to push back Patton's 1st Infantry Division from the heights at El Ghatar, they were severely battered and lost half of their remaining tanks. Montgomery decided to send the 30th Corps to launch a frontal assault on the Mareth line to pin down the enemy while maneuvering southwest with Freiburg's New Zealanders, backed by tanks. However, the Germans were well aware of Freiburg's strategy, and the attack on March 20th by the 50th Division ended in failure. Montgomery, having prematurely announced his success, was unsettled. Nonetheless, he quickly regrouped and dispatched Horrocks with the 10th Corps to support the New Zealanders in an attack toward the coast, over 30 kilometers behind the Mareth line. Simultaneously, he sent the 4th Indian Division for a closer flanking maneuver. On March 26, the New Zealanders and Horrocks' armored brigades advanced together, breaking through the weakened German defenses at the Tabaga Gap. General Giovanni Mess, who commanded the 1st Italian Army, rapidly withdrew his forces up the coast toward Tunis. Although it was somewhat successful, the Axis forces managed to escape once again. The Desert Air Force harassed the German retreating units, inflicting casualties such as Oberst Klaus Graf Schenk von Stauffenberg, who lost a hand and an eye to enemy fire. On April 7th, units from the 1st and 8th Armies came together. The two forces could not have been more different. The desert veterans, in their weathered, sand-colored tanks and trucks, exhibited a remarkable indifference, as well as a disregard for uniform regulations. Their experience, though harsh at times, had generally been marked by a greater respect for prisoner lives and very few civilian casualties in the largely empty desert. The local Senussi tribe managed to evade much of the fiercest fighting, though some of them and several of their camels lost legs in the minefields. In contrast, the First Army, engaged in the predominantly mountainous warfare of the far eastern Atlas, confronted a much grimmer conflict. The shock of combat hit overconfident, inexperienced troops, especially American units, hard when they faced battle-hardened Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units, resulting in a traumatic experience. While some suffered psychological casualties, many quickly became brutalized as a means of survival. Some soldiers became completely dehumanized. They engaged in sadistic killings of prisoners and even shot at Tunisian Arabs for entertainment. They treated people on camels as targets in a shooting gallery. British soldiers were generally more disciplined, but they were still influenced by the racist attitudes of that era. Only a few built friendships with the locals. The French troops were no better. Ironically, these soldiers and officers from the former Vichy army wanted revenge on their Arab subjects, who often worked with the Germans due to harsh anti-Jewish measures. As the campaign neared its victorious conclusion, relations among the three allies began to deteriorate. British arrogance fueled a growing disdain for them among many American officers. Eisenhower's confidence had taken a hit during the winter months, but it was coming back. His army was learning to improve. The planning for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was progressing well. The Axis powers were about to be fully driven out of North Africa, and the supply lines were finally functioning effectively. The British were amazed by the generosity of American industry. They were also taken aback by the waste, though they had little room to complain since they benefited too. However, even Eisenhower felt awkward about the large size of Allied Force headquarters, which had over 3,000 personnel. By early May, the remaining Axis forces were pushed into the northern tip of Tunisia, including Bizerta, Tunis, and the Cape Bon Peninsula. Though they totaled more than 250,000 personnel, just under half were German, and many of the Italians were non-combatants. Low on ammunition and fuel, the Germans realized their end was near, making bitter jokes about Tunisgrad. Hitler's refusal to evacuate forces to protect southern Europe did nothing for their morale. They found it hard to believe he was still sending reinforcements during April and May, all of whom would also become prisoners. Allied fighters lay in wait in the Mediterranean skies, making easy targets of the Junkers 52 and large Messerschmitt 323 transport planes. Over half of the Luftwaffe's remaining transport fleet was destroyed in the final 2 months of the campaign. On Sunday, April 18th, 4 American fighter squadrons and a squadron of Spitfires ambushed a group of 65 transports that were being escorted by 20 fighters. In a confrontation that became known as the Palm Sunday Turkey Shoot, Allied aircraft shot down 74 enemy planes. While the Red Army was effectively overcoming the vast majority of the German forces, the Western Allies were also making significant strides against the Luftwaffe. Air Marshal Conyngham, who led the Desert Air Force, was infuriated by the lack of acknowledgement Montgomery gave to the Royal Air Force's contributions in North Africa. The combined efforts of the Allied Air Forces and the Royal Navy in disrupting the Axis supply routes across the Mediterranean were just as crucial to the ultimate success as the ground troops' efforts. The final stages of dismantling the bridgehead proved to be challenging. Montgomery relentlessly attacked the mountainous Enfidaville area on the coast south of Tunis, but he saw little progress and incurred heavy casualties. The Eighth Army was lagging behind the Americans when it came to grasping the tough lessons of mountain warfare. Other assaults by the First Army to the west faced fierce resistance. The Irish Guards moved through a cornfield, aiming to take a German position while under gunfire from machine guns, artillery, and a new 6-barreled mortar called the Nebelwerfer. When a soldier was struck, a fellow comrade would plant his weapon upright in the ground. A corporal noted, rifle butts appeared everywhere, marking the dead, dying, and wounded. He recalled stopping next to a guardsman who was begging for water. The man had horrific injuries. The corporal could see the broken bones of his arm and a large wound in his side. The survivors of that assault charged toward an olive grove on the hill ahead, forcing the Germans to retreat. However, In one of the trenches, the corporal and two other guardsmen heard German voices coming from a bunker. They threw grenades inside and stepped back. Afterward, the corporal cautiously looked into the darkness. There must have been 20 Germans scattered about in there. They were all bandaged, and those who were not dead were screaming in agony. This was where the retreating enemy left their wounded. He turned away without feeling any sympathy. They had done far worse to his fallen comrades in the scorched cornfields. Only Bradley's 2nd Corps, located directly west of Tunis, made a notable advance in early May. Realizing his mistake at Enfidaville, Montgomery convinced Alexander that a concentrated strike was essential to bring this drawn-out battle to an end. On May 6th, Horrocks, along with the 7th Armored Division, the 4th Indian Division, and the 201st Guards Brigade, initiated Operation Strike from the southwest. They followed an even more intense artillery barrage than what had been seen at Alamein. They advanced toward Tunis, effectively dividing the pocket in two. Meanwhile, the American forces captured Bizerta on the north coast. Once again, led by the 11th Hussars in their battle-worn armored cars, British troops entered Tunis the following afternoon. By May 12th, it was all concluded. Nearly 250,000 troops surrendered, including 12 generals. Hitler convinced himself he was correct to continue fighting in North Africa until the very end. He believed this would delay an Allied invasion of southern Europe and maintain Mussolini's power. However, he had once again lost forces that he would desperately need in future battles.